When meteorologists first saw the satellite images on January 30th, 2019, they couldn't believe what they were witnessing. A massive polar vortex was descending from Canada, carrying temperatures that would plunge 20 to 40 degrees below zero across the upper Midwest and Great Lakes. Wind chills were predicted to hit a bone-chilling minus 70 degrees Fahrenheit, with the potential to cause frostbite on exposed skin in as little as 5 minutes. Most sensible people would lock their doors, stoke their fires, and wait out nature's fury from the safety of their homes. But when Daniel Mitchell woke up that morning on his 400-acre cattle ranch in northern Wisconsin, he knew that staying inside wasn't an option. Outside his frosted window, 250 newborn calves were depending on him for survival. If you're watching this incredible true story right now, I want you to do something for me. Hit that subscribe button and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. Have you ever experienced weather this extreme? I need to know you're with me on this journey, because what happens next will test everything you think you know about human determination. Newborn calves are especially vulnerable to hypothermia and cold stress. While adult cattle have a functioning rumen that acts as their heating core during winter, newborn calves are much more susceptible to life-threatening temperature drops. A calf's internal body temperature should be between 101 and 102 degrees Fahrenheit, and when it drops below that threshold, their bodies begin shutting down non-essential functions to protect vital organs. At 5:30 a.m., Daniel stepped onto his porch and felt the Arctic air hit him like a physical blow. The digital thermometer read minus 38 degrees Fahrenheit, but the howling wind made it feel exponentially worse. At these temperatures, with wind speeds of 15 miles per hour, the effective wind chill dropped to minus 67 degrees, cold enough to freeze exposed skin in under 10 minutes. The night before, Daniel had made the difficult decision to leave the calves in the pasture rather than overcrowding them in the barn. The barn could only safely hold 180 animals, and moving 250 calves in a blizzard seemed more dangerous than leaving them with their mothers in the field. He had reinforced the windbreaks, provided extra bedding, and ensured the water sources were accessible. But now, looking at the weather conditions that meteorologists were calling life-threatening, he realized he may have made a catastrophic mistake. As Daniel trudged through knee-deep snow toward the pasture, each breath created ice crystals that stung his lungs. The wind was relentless, cutting through his heavy winter gear and making visibility nearly impossible. Even ranchers accustomed to harsh winters were calling this weather event unprecedented in its severity and duration. What Daniel discovered when he reached the first group of cattle would force him to make a decision that defied all conventional wisdom about cold weather safety. The mother cows were clustered together, their thick winter coats crusted with ice, but they were surviving. However, scattered around the pasture, Daniel could see the smaller silhouettes of calves, some moving sluggishly, others lying motionless in the snow. When cattle experience hypothermia, mild symptoms begin when body temperature drops to 86-89 degrees Fahrenheit. Moderate hypothermia occurs at 71 to 85 degrees, and severe hypothermia sets in below 68 degrees. Once a calf's rectal temperature drops below 82 degrees Fahrenheit, they cannot return to normal temperature without direct human intervention. Daniel counted 17 calves that weren't moving. In conditions this extreme, he had maybe 30 minutes before the cold would claim more lives. The nearest veterinarian was 40 miles away on roads that were now impassable due to blowing snow. Emergency services had suspended operations due to the dangerous conditions. Daniel was completely on his own, standing in that frozen pasture with the wind howling around him and the lives of dozens of animals hanging in the balance. Daniel Mitchell made a decision that would either save his entire herd or cost him everything. He was about to attempt something that every cold weather safety manual explicitly warns against. He was going to bring 250 cattle into his own home. What happened next would become legendary among ranchers across the Midwest, a story of human ingenuity and determination that proves sometimes the most ridiculous ideas are the only ones that work when everything else fails. Daniel's farmhouse had never been designed to shelter livestock. Built in 1987, the modest two-story home featured a finished basement, main living area, and upstairs bedrooms where Daniel lived with his wife, Sarah, and their 2 teenage children, the largest open. Space was the family room, measuring roughly 24 by 16 feet. By any reasonable calculation, it was completely inadequate for housing 250 cattle. But reasonable calculations don't account for desperation and a farmer's willingness to sacrifice everything for his animals. Cattle in good condition with thick fat layers are better able to withstand cold than thin cattle, but newborn calves lack this crucial insulation. The fat layer acts as an insulating barrier between the animal's core and the environment. Daniel's calves, born just days or weeks earlier, had minimal body fat and were entirely dependent on their mother's milk and their own rapid metabolism to generate body heat. As Daniel stood in his kitchen at 6:15 a.m., warming his hands around a cup of coffee, he tried to think through the logistics of his plan. Sarah emerged from the bedroom, took one look at her husband's expression, and knew something extraordinary was about to happen. "The calves aren't going to make it," Daniel said quietly. 17 are already down, and if this wind keeps up, we'll lose most of them by noon. Sarah had been married to Daniel for 23 years. She'd seen him work through floods, droughts, and economic downturns that would have broken other farmers, but she'd never seen the look of desperate determination that was on his face now. "What are you thinking?" she asked, though part of her already knew. "We're bringing them inside, all of them." The silence stretched between them. Outside, the wind rattled the windows with such force that the house seemed to shudder. Weather reports were confirming that wind gusts up to 35 miles per hour were combining with the sub-zero temperatures to create wind chill values as low as -60 degrees. "Daniel, that's impossible. The house can't—" "The house will hold," he interrupted. "We'll start with the weakest calves in the basement, then work our way up. The living room, the kitchen even, the bedrooms if we have to. We'll figure out the logistics as we go." Sarah understood cattle as well as her husband did. She knew that cattle experiencing cold stress must increase their metabolic rate to supply more body heat, which increases their dietary requirements, particularly for energy. Bringing cattle indoors would immediately reduce their energy expenditure and give the weakest animals a chance to recover. But the practical challenges were staggering. How would they get 250 large animals into the house? How would they manage waste? What about food and water? What about the structural integrity of floors designed for human occupancy, not livestock? "The neighbors will think we've lost our minds," Sarah said. "The neighbors aren't here," Daniel replied, "and by the time they could get here, half our herd will be dead." Daniel's decision wasn't just about saving the calves, it was about preserving years of careful breeding, genetic improvement, and financial investment. Each calf represented approximately $200 in potential income. More importantly, these animals were the foundation of his family's livelihood and their connection to 5 generations of farming on this land. At 6:45 a.m., Daniel and Sarah began removing furniture from their living room. The couch, coffee table, television, and dining room set were quickly moved into the garage. They spread every towel, blanket, and tarp they could find across the hardwood floors, creating makeshift bedding that would provide insulation and traction for the animals. Their 2 children, awakened by the commotion, came downstairs to find their parents preparing to convert their home into an emergency livestock shelter. "Dad, are you seriously bringing cows into our house?" 16-year-old Jake asked. "Not cows," Daniel corrected. "Calves. And yes, unless you have a better idea for keeping them alive in -70-degree weather." The first challenge was creating pathways wide enough for the cattle to enter the house. Daniel used a shovel to clear snow from the back porch and basement entrance, creating a gradual ramp that would allow the calves to walk directly into the lower level of the house. Experienced farmers know that cattle can handle extreme cold when they have adequate food, clean water, and protection from wind. Daniel's house could provide the wind protection and controlled temperature that the animals desperately needed. By 7:30 a.m., everything was ready. Daniel put on his heaviest winter gear, grabbed a halter and lead rope, and headed back into the brutal cold. The first calf he would attempt to save was lying motionless near the fence line, its breathing shallow and rapid, classic signs of severe hypothermia. The most audacious livestock rescue in Wisconsin history was about to begin. The calf Daniel approached first was a Holstein heifer, born just 4 days earlier. Her black and white markings were barely visible through the layer of ice that had formed on her coat. When a calf's body temperature drops, their circulation begins shutting down to protect vital organs, causing blood to be redirected away from extremities like legs, ears, and tail. This calf's ears were already showing signs of frostbite, and her movements were sluggish and uncoordinated. Before we continue with this incredible rescue, I want to hear from you. Drop a comment below telling me where you're watching. from and whether you've ever had to make an impossible decision to save something you cared about. And don't forget to subscribe. This story gets even more unbelievable. Kneeling beside the calf in the snow, Daniel could feel the cold penetrating through his insulated coveralls within seconds. At wind chill temperatures below -18 degrees, frostbite can occur in under 30 minutes on exposed skin. Daniel was experiencing wind chill approaching -70 degrees, giving him perhaps 5 minutes of safe exposure time. A normal calf's body temperature should be between 101 and 102 degrees Fahrenheit. When Daniel checked this calf with a rectal thermometer he always carried during calving season, the reading was 89 degrees, firmly in the mild hypothermia range, but still recoverable with immediate intervention. The challenge was getting an 85-pound calf that was barely conscious to walk 200 yards through deep snow to the house. Daniel tried lifting the calf, but his heavy winter clothing and the awkward weight distribution made it nearly impossible to carry her safely. Instead, he decided to use a technique his father had taught him decades earlier. Daniel removed his heavy outer jacket and wrapped it around the calf's torso, creating a makeshift sling that would help retain what little body heat she had left. He then gently coaxed her to her feet. The calf wobbled unsteadily, but managed to stand with support. Cattle naturally seek shelter from wind, and their survival instincts remain strong even during hypothermic episodes. As Daniel began leading the calf toward the house, she seemed to sense that warmth and safety lay in that direction. Her steps were unsteady, but she was moving. The journey from the pasture to the house normally took 3 minutes. In these conditions, with frequent stops to allow both Daniel and the calf to regain strength, it took nearly 15 minutes. By the time they reached the basement entrance, Daniel's fingers were numb despite his insulated gloves, and his exposed cheek was stinging with the beginning stages of frostbite. Sarah had prepared the basement by setting up heat lamps, borrowed from their chicken coop, and spreading thick layers of straw across the concrete floor. The basement temperature, normally around 55 degrees in winter, had already risen to 62 degrees thanks to the supplemental heating. The moment the calf entered the warm basement, the change was immediate and dramatic. Her breathing, which had been shallow and rapid, began to slow and deepen. The ice on her coat started melting, creating steam that rose from her body. Within 10 minutes, she was standing more steadily and showing interest in her surroundings. "One down, 2:49 to go," Daniel said to Sarah, though he knew the math was more complicated than that. Not all the calves were in critical condition, but the weather forecast showed no signs of improvement for at least 18 hours. Extended periods of sub-zero temperatures create cumulative stress effects on livestock that can be fatal even to animals that initially appear stable. Daniel's strategy was to triage the animals, bringing the most critical cases inside first. The basement could comfortably hold about 25 calves without overcrowding. The main floor would accommodate another 30-40 animals, but that still left more than 180 calves that would need shelter somewhere. As Daniel headed back outside for the second rescue, he realized that his ridiculous plan was already working. The first calf was not only alive, but recovering. However, each rescue trip was taking 15 minutes, and at that rate, he would need more than 60 hours to bring all the animals to safety. With the extreme cold continuing and more calves succumbing every hour, he needed to develop a more efficient system. The answer came from an unexpected source. Sarah's brother, Tom, who lived 3 miles away, arrived on his snowmobile just as Daniel was preparing to make his second trip to the pasture. Tom took one look at the situation and immediately understood what needed to happen. "You can't do this alone," Tom shouted over the wind. "We need more people and a better system." Within 30 minutes, Tom had contacted 3 neighboring farmers who were willing to brave the weather to help with the rescue. But even with additional manpower, they were about to discover that bringing 250 cattle into a residential house would create challenges none of them had anticipated. The real test of Daniel Mitchell's impossible plan was just beginning. By 9:30 a.m., Daniel's rescue operation had transformed from a desperate one-man effort into a coordinated community response. Farmers across the region were facing similar challenges, but news of Daniel's unconventional solution spread quickly through the tight-knit agricultural community. Tom arrived with his neighbor Pete Henriksen, a dairy farmer with 30 years of experience in extreme weather management. Close behind came Mark and Jennifer Walsh from the adjacent property, driving their ATV equipped with a small trailer designed for hauling feed. The fourth volunteer was Dr. Emily Rodriguez, the local large animal veterinarian who had managed to navigate the back roads on her four-wheel drive truck. "Daniel, this is either the craziest thing I've ever seen or the most brilliant," Dr. Rodriguez said as she surveyed the operation. "But if it works, you'll have saved more animals in one day than most vets see in a month." The team quickly established an efficient rescue protocol. Mark and Jennifer would use their ATV to transport the most critical calves from the pasture to the house, while Tom and Pete worked on foot to identify and stabilize animals that could walk with assistance. Dr. Rodriguez would perform rapid triage assessments, determining which animals needed immediate indoor shelter versus those that might survive with temporary wind protection. Daniel and Sarah coordinated the indoor logistics, managing the growing number of animals now occupying their home and ensuring each had adequate space, bedding, and access to water. The basement was reaching capacity with 23 calves, ranging in age from 3 days to 2 weeks old. The veterinarian noted that calves brought indoors were showing remarkable recovery rates, with body temperatures returning to normal ranges within 30–45 minutes of entering the heated environment. "The temperature differential is saving their lives," Dr. Rodriguez explained as she monitored the animals. "Outside, they're burning calories just to maintain basic metabolic functions. Inside, those same calories can go toward growth and immune function." The main floor of the house presented new challenges. The living room, dining room, and kitchen areas were now home to 31 calves, with makeshift barriers created from furniture and plywood to prevent the animals from accessing stairs or potentially dangerous areas. The hardwood floors, protected by layers of tarps and straw, were holding up better than expected. But the noise was overwhelming. 31 calves calling for their mothers, combined with the sound of hooves on hard surfaces, created a cacophony that made communication difficult. More concerning was the waste management issue. Even young calves produced significant amounts of manure, and the indoor environment was becoming challenging to maintain. Sarah had anticipated this problem and established a rotation system. Every 2 hours, teams would quickly shovel waste into buckets and dispose of it outside, while simultaneously adding fresh bedding and checking water supplies. Cattle require constant access to clean water, and limiting water intake can significantly reduce feed consumption and make it more difficult for animals to meet their energy requirements during cold stress. Sarah had placed large stock tanks throughout the house, filled with lukewarm water that the calves could access freely. By noon, 127 calves were safely inside the house, with the remainder either in the barn or showing signs of stability in the pasture, with improved windbreak protection that the team had quickly constructed using hay bales and tarps. The transformation of the Mitchell home was complete. The basement housed the youngest and most vulnerable calves, maintaining a consistent temperature of 68 degrees. The main floor accommodated animals that needed shelter, but were strong enough to handle slightly cooler temperatures around 60 degrees. The upstairs bedrooms, which had initially seemed off-limits, were now being prepared for additional animals as the outdoor conditions continued to deteriorate. Weather reports indicated that the extreme cold would persist for another 24–36 hours, with wind chill values potentially dropping even lower as wind speeds increased. "I've been practicing veterinary medicine for 15 years, Dr. Rodriguez told the assembled volunteers as they took a brief break to warm up and assess their progress. "I've seen farmers do extraordinary things to save their livestock, but I've never seen anything like this. You're not just keeping these animals alive, you're maintaining their health and body condition in a way that will allow them to return to normal productivity once this weather passes." The success of the operation was evident in the numbers. Of the 17 calves that Daniel had found unresponsive that morning, 14 were now standing, eating, and showing normal behaviors. The 3 that didn't survive had been too far into hypothermic shock when discovered, but the survival rate was extraordinary given the extreme conditions. However, the most challenging part of the operation was yet to come. As afternoon approached, the team faced a new problem: how to manage 127 large animals inside a residential structure overnight, with temperatures outside expected to drop even further. The real test of Daniel Mitchell's impossible plan was about to begin. As darkness fell on January 30th, 2019, the Mitchell farmhouse had become something unprecedented in agricultural history, a fully functional livestock shelter that also happened to be someone's home. The transformation was so complete that visitors entering through the front door would find themselves immediately greeted by curious calves rather than typical household furnishings. Temperature readings showed the outdoor thermometer had dropped to -42 degrees Fahrenheit, with wind gusts reaching 35 miles per hour, creating wind chill values approaching -75 degrees. At these temperatures, exposed skin can freeze in less than 2 minutes, making outdoor work extremely dangerous. Daniel established a round-the-clock monitoring system with the volunteers. 4-hour shifts ensured that someone was always awake to check on the animals, manage heating systems, and respond to any emergencies. The basement, with its 23 youngest calves, required the most attention. These animals needed feeding every few hours and constant temperature monitoring. Dr. Rodriguez had set up a medical station in what used to be the Mitchell family's office, complete with emergency supplies, thermometers, and treatment medications. "We're essentially running an intensive care unit for hypothermic livestock," she explained to the night shift volunteers. "Every animal in this house arrived in some stage of cold stress, and recovery is an ongoing process." The logistics of managing 127 calves indoors proved more complex than anyone had anticipated. Cattle normally consume 2 to 3% of their body weight in feed daily, and cold stress increases these requirements significantly. With limited indoor space for hay storage, the team had to establish a feeding schedule that involved bringing small amounts of hay inside every few hours. Water consumption was equally challenging. The calves were drinking more than usual as their bodies worked to restore normal temperature and hydration levels. Sarah and Jennifer Walsh had connected a series of garden hoses from the basement utility sink to stock tanks throughout the house, creating a primitive but effective water distribution system. The structural integrity of the house was holding remarkably well. The hardwood floors, despite the constant traffic from hooved animals, showed minimal damage thanks to the thick layer of straw bedding. More importantly, the heating system was managing to maintain comfortable temperatures throughout the structure, even with the constant opening of doors as volunteers moved between indoor and outdoor areas. But the most surprising aspect of the operation was how quickly the calves adapted to their unusual environment. Cattle are naturally adaptable animals that modify their behavior to seek shelter from wind and cold. Within hours of entering the house, the calves had established resting patterns, feeding routines, and social hierarchies similar to what they would display in a traditional barn setting. The noise level, which had been overwhelming during the initial rescue phase, had settled into a more manageable rhythm. The calves were quieter at night, and the absence of wind noise made communication between volunteers much easier. At 2 a.m., Daniel made his rounds through the house, checking on each group of animals. In the basement, the youngest calves were sleeping peacefully in small groups, their breathing deep and regular, a stark contrast to the shallow, rapid breathing he had observed just 18 hours earlier when they were hypothermic. The main floor animals were more active, with some calves exploring their unusual surroundings. Several had discovered that the kitchen linoleum was particularly comfortable for lying down, and others seemed fascinated by their own reflections in the sliding glass door that led to the back patio. "It's like having the world's strangest sleepover," Sarah commented as she helped Daniel check water levels in the upstairs containers. The second floor was now housing 35 calves in the master bedroom, 2 guest rooms, and the hallway. The carpeted surfaces, while not ideal for livestock, were providing additional warmth and comfort for animals that were still recovering from their exposure to extreme cold. Extended periods of sub-zero temperatures create cumulative stress effects that can take several days for livestock to fully recover from. Dr. Rodriguez's overnight assessments showed that while most calves were stable, their complete recovery would require continued warmth and monitoring for at least 48-72 hours. As Daniel completed his 3 a.m. rounds, he reflected on the surreal nature of what they had accomplished. 18 months earlier, he would have considered the idea of housing cattle in his home to be not just impractical, but impossible. Yet here they were, successfully maintaining the health and well-being of 127 animals in a residential structure, with a survival rate that exceeded what most farmers could have achieved using traditional shelter methods. The overnight period would prove to be the critical test of whether this unprecedented rescue operation could sustain itself until the extreme weather passed. Outside, the wind continued to howl, but inside the Mitchell farmhouse, 127 calves were sleeping safely, warm, fed, and alive, because one farmer had been willing to attempt the impossible. Dawn on January 31st brought both relief and new challenges. The immediate crisis had passed. All 127 calves housed in the Mitchell farmhouse had survived the night with no additional casualties. However, 18 hours of operating a residential livestock facility had pushed both the house infrastructure and the volunteer team to their limits. The heating system, designed for a 4-person household, had been running constantly for nearly 20 hours to maintain appropriate temperatures for over 130 occupants. Daniel's heating bill for that single day would later exceed his typical monthly winter cost, but the system was holding. More concerning was the strain on the septic system, which had never been designed to handle waste from this many large animals. "We need to start planning the transition back to normal facilities," Dr. Rodriguez announced during the morning volunteer meeting. "The animals are stable, but we can't maintain this setup indefinitely." Weather forecasts showed that while the extreme wind chill would begin to moderate by late afternoon, temperatures would remain well below zero for another 24 to 48 hours. The question facing the team was whether they could safely move animals back to traditional shelter before conditions fully normalized. The basement calves, being the youngest and most vulnerable, would need to remain indoors the longest. The main floor animals, having shown strong recovery, could potentially be moved to the heated barn if additional warming equipment could be installed. The upstairs calves, which had adapted remarkably well to their carpeted accommodations, represented a middle category that would require careful assessment. Pete Henriksen had spent the early morning hours working with portable heaters and generator equipment to prepare the main barn for receiving animals. "If we can get the barn temperature up to 45 to 50 degrees and eliminate drafts, we can start moving the stronger calves back," he reported. "But it's still going to be a gradual process." The logistical challenges of the transition were complicated by the fact that many roads in the county remained impassable. The milk truck that normally picked up Daniel's dairy production couldn't navigate the ice-covered farm roads, meaning that regular operations were still suspended. More critically, feed deliveries were impossible, and the hay stored in the house would be exhausted within another day. Sarah had documented the entire experience with photographs and detailed notes, recognizing that what they were accomplishing had never been attempted before. "I keep thinking, someone should be filming this," she told Jennifer Walsh as they prepared morning feed for the basement calves. "Nobody's going to believe it happened." The adaptability of the animals continued to amaze everyone involved. Cattle are remarkably resilient when provided with adequate warmth, nutrition, and protection from environmental stresses. Several of the calves had gained weight overnight, indicating that their bodies were no longer burning calories simply to maintain core temperature. Dr. Rodriguez's morning medical assessments revealed that 14 of the original 17 hypothermic calves were now showing completely normal vital signs. The 3 that had been too far into cold shock to save represented a mortality rate of less than 2%. Extraordinary considering the severity of the weather event. Under normal circumstances, we would expect to lose 15 to 20% of newborn calves during a weather event of this magnitude, the veterinarian explained. "Your unconventional approach saved not just individual animals, but preserved the genetic investment and economic foundation of this operation." However, the stress on the Mitchell family was becoming evident. Neither Daniel nor Sarah had slept more than 2 consecutive hours since the rescue began. Their teenage children, while supportive of the operation, were essentially displaced from their own home. The family was living in their garage, using sleeping bags and portable heaters to stay warm while their house served as an emergency animal shelter. Mark Walsh raised the question that everyone was beginning to consider. How long can we realistically maintain this setup? We're all running on adrenaline and coffee, and that's not sustainable. The answer came from an unexpected source. At 11 a.m., a convoy of vehicles managed to navigate the farm roads, bringing additional volunteers from neighboring counties who had heard about the rescue operation through agricultural networks and social media. More importantly, they brought portable livestock shelters, generator-powered heating equipment, and enough feed to sustain the animals for several more days. "Word is spreading about what you've accomplished here," said Jim Patterson, a cattle rancher from 40 miles south who had organized the convoy. "Farmers across 3 states are talking about this. You've proven that sometimes the impossible solution is the only solution that works." The arrival of additional resources meant that the transition back to conventional shelter could be managed safely and gradually. But it also marked the end of the most extraordinary phase of the rescue operation, the 18 hours when a Wisconsin farmhouse had successfully functioned as a life-saving sanctuary for 127 cattle. The story was far from over, but the most critical chapter had been written through the determination of one farmer and the support of a community that understood that sometimes saving lives requires abandoning conventional wisdom entirely. By the morning of February 2, 2019, the Mitchell farmhouse had been fully restored to its original purpose as a family home, but the impact of what had occurred there would resonate throughout the agricultural community for years to come. The polar vortex officially ended, with temperatures returning to more typical winter ranges, but the story of the cattle rescue had taken on a life of its own. The final statistics were remarkable. Of the 250 calves that had been at risk during the extreme weather event, 247 survived, a 98.8% survival rate that veterinary experts called unprecedented for livestock exposed to such severe conditions. The 3 calves that were lost had been found too late in hypothermic shock to respond to warming interventions. Dr. Rodriguez documented the medical outcomes in a case study that would later be published in the Journal of Veterinary Emergency Medicine. The rapid warming achieved through indoor housing allowed hypothermic animals to recover metabolic function within hours rather than days, she wrote. The controlled environment eliminated wind stress and provided optimal conditions for physiological recovery. The study showed that calves housed indoors during the extreme weather event experienced less weight loss, maintained better immune function, and returned to normal growth rates more quickly than animals that had been sheltered using conventional methods during similar weather events. But the scientific validation was secondary to the practical impact on Daniel's operation. His herd emerged from the weather crisis in better condition than anyone had dared hope. Within a week of returning to normal housing, milk production from the dairy cows had returned to pre-event levels, and the calves showed no signs of lasting health effects from their hypothermic experience. The economic impact was equally significant. Each surviving calf represented approximately $1,200 in potential income, meaning that Daniel's unconventional rescue had preserved nearly $300,000 in livestock value. More importantly, the genetic investment represented by years of selective breeding remained intact, preserving the foundation for future herd improvement. Word of the rescue spread far beyond the local agricultural community. Agricultural Extension Services from 3 states requested detailed reports on the techniques used. The story appeared in farming magazines, veterinary journals, and eventually mainstream media outlets fascinated by the image of cattle living temporarily in a residential home. I've received calls from farmers as far away as Montana and Texas, Daniel told a reporter from the Wisconsin State Journal. Some think I was crazy, but most understand that sometimes you have to be willing to try anything to save your animals. The Mitchell family's sacrifice had not gone unnoticed by their neighbors. A community fund was established to help cover the costs of restoring the house, including professional cleaning, floor refinishing, and replacement of household items that had been damaged or contaminated during the rescue operation. The fund raised more than $15,000, with contributions coming from farmers across multiple states. Sarah's detailed documentation of the event became the foundation for new cold weather emergency protocols, recommended by the Wisconsin Dairy Association. What the Mitchells accomplished wasn't just a rescue, it was a proof of concept, explained association spokesperson Linda Morrison. They demonstrated that with creativity and determination, farmers can save livestock even under the most extreme conditions. The long-term impacts extended beyond agriculture. Emergency management agencies began incorporating unconventional shelter options into their disaster preparedness guidelines. For rural communities, the concept of using residential structures as temporary livestock shelter, while still considered a last resort, became an officially recognized emergency management strategy. The 2019 polar vortex affected millions of people across the Midwest and Great Lakes regions, causing widespread power outages, transportation disruptions, and agricultural losses estimated in the hundreds of millions of dollars. Against that backdrop, the Mitchell Farms success story provided a rare example of human ingenuity triumphing over natural disaster. 1 year later, Daniel Mitchell was invited to speak at the National Cattlemen's Association annual convention, where his presentation, "When Conventional Shelter Isn't Enough," became one of the most attended sessions. His basic message was simple. Sometimes the solution that seems impossible is the only one that actually works. The house itself bore few permanent reminders of its temporary role as a livestock shelter. New hardwood floors replaced those that had been damaged, and a thorough professional cleaning had eliminated any lingering odors. But the Mitchell family kept one reminder of those extraordinary 18 hours, a small plaque by the front door that read, "Home is where the heart is, and sometimes where the herd is too." Today, Daniel Mitchell continues operating his cattle ranch with the same dedication that characterized his response to the polar vortex crisis. But farmers across the region know that when faced with the impossible, sometimes the most ridiculous solution is the one that saves everything that matters. The day the wind chill hit -70 degrees, one farmer refused to let nature win. What he did next saved every calf and proved that determination can overcome any obstacle. 5 years after the polar vortex of 2019, the story of Daniel Mitchell's cattle rescue continues to influence emergency management practices throughout the agricultural Midwest. What began as one farmer's desperate attempt to save his herd has evolved into a comprehensive case study in crisis innovation and community resilience. The immediate aftermath of the rescue operation revealed impacts that extended far beyond the Mitchell farm. Agricultural economists calculated that livestock losses across the region during the polar vortex exceeded $200 million, making the preservation of Daniel's entire herd a significant statistical outlier that drew academic attention. Dr. Rodriguez's published research on the medical outcomes became required reading in veterinary emergency medicine programs across North America. The Mitchell case demonstrated that rapid intervention and controlled environment recovery could prevent cascading physiological failures in hypothermic livestock, she explained in a follow-up study published 3 years later. The approach challenged conventional wisdom about the limitations of emergency animal care. Subsequent research confirmed that cattle housed in temperature-controlled environments during extreme weather events maintain better body condition, experience less immune system stress, and return to productive status more quickly than animals sheltered using traditional methods. The techniques pioneered during those 18 hours have been adapted for use in purpose-built emergency shelters. Several Midwest agricultural extension offices now maintain portable livestock warming units that can be deployed rapidly during extreme weather events. The units incorporate lessons learned from the Mitchell rescue, including specific guidelines for temperature management, ventilation, and waste control in confined spaces. But perhaps the most significant legacy is cultural. Daniel's willingness to attempt the seemingly impossible has become a touchstone for agricultural resilience in the face of increasingly extreme weather events. Climate. Scientists project that polar vortex events may become more frequent and severe due to changes in Arctic weather patterns, making cold weather livestock protection an increasingly critical concern for northern farmers. The story has been incorporated into disaster preparedness curricula at agricultural colleges throughout the Midwest. Students in farm management programs study the decision-making process that led to the rescue, analyzing the risk assessment, resource allocation, and community mobilization that made success possible. The Mitchell case teaches us that emergency management isn't just about following established protocols, explains Dr. Michael Thompson, who teaches agricultural crisis management at Iowa State University. Sometimes you have to be willing to write entirely new protocols based on immediate circumstances and available resources. The community response aspect of the rescue has proven equally influential. The rapid mobilization of neighboring farmers, the veterinary support, and the resource sharing that enabled the operation's success have become a model for rural emergency cooperation. Several counties in Wisconsin have established formal mutual aid agreements for livestock emergencies, directly inspired by the informal network that supported the Mitchell rescue. Tom Henriksen, who was among the first volunteers to arrive that morning, now serves as coordinator for the regional livestock emergency response network. What we learned that day was that sometimes the best expertise is collective expertise, he reflects. Nobody had ever done what Daniel was attempting, but together we figured out how to make it work. The technological innovations developed during the rescue have found applications beyond emergency management. The feeding and watering systems improvised for indoor cattle management have been adapted for use in research facilities studying animal behavior and welfare. The rapid setup techniques for protective bedding and waste management are now standard components of mobile veterinary care units. Sarah Mitchell's detailed documentation of the event proved invaluable for subsequent analysis and replication. Her photographs and written records provided the foundation for training materials that have been distributed to agricultural extension offices across multiple states. I never expected that keeping a diary would become part of agricultural emergency management, she notes with characteristic humor. The economic impacts continue to resonate. Insurance companies have revised their policies for extreme weather livestock coverage, recognizing that unconventional shelter methods can be financially justified when they prevent catastrophic losses. Several companies now offer specific coverage for emergency shelter modifications, directly citing the Mitchell precedent. Analysis of subsequent polar vortex events shows that farms, using modified versions of the Mitchell approach, have consistently achieved higher livestock survival rates than those relying solely on traditional shelter methods. The Mitchell farm itself has become an unofficial destination for agricultural visitors. Farmers facing their own challenging weather conditions have traveled hundreds of miles to learn about the techniques and decision-making processes that enabled the rescue. Daniel estimates that he's hosted more than 200 such visits. Over the past 5 years, people want to understand how to think differently about problems that seem impossible, he explains. The answer isn't really about the specific techniques we used. It's about being willing to abandon conventional approaches when conventional approaches aren't sufficient. Today, as climate patterns continue to evolve and extreme weather events become more frequent, the lesson of the Mitchell cattle rescue remains relevant. When faced with impossible circumstances, the most effective solution might be the one that seems most impossible to attempt. The day the wind chill hit -70 degrees, one farmer's refusal to accept defeat saved 247 lives and changed how an entire industry approaches emergency management. Sometimes the most ridiculous idea turns out to be the only idea that works.